Welcome to Future Projections here at SCI-Arc. Before I introduce you to tonight's speaker, let me say a few things. My name is Carl Chu. I'm a faculty here at SCI-Arc, and I'm very excited to be here, and because SCI-Arc is moving towards the future, and this lecture series reflect that. According to Emmanuel Levinas, a French philosopher who had a lot of influence on Derrida, he says that the Western tradition is very much determined or predominated by interest in numbers and beings. And tonight's lecture also, I'm sure, as Michael Benedikt presented to you, will require that a lot of supposition of its mechanisms is based on the idea of numbers, calculations, and being. And as architects, there's a phobia for numbers, at least speaking for myself. But there is definitely no sort of fear of beings. In fact, there is an overabundance aspiration for beings in the philosophical sense. The reason I suggest that is that because out there in the reception, I was talking to Michael Dobry, whom I personally would like to welcome to SCI-Arc, and whom I have learned a lot from him as well. And I'm sure he will be a very significant voice for SCI-Arc in the years to come. And we have a lot of exciting discussions and frustrations as well. Him coming from a scientific background, and some of us coming from architectural backgrounds. So there's a kind of initial collision of ideas and interests and so forth. And so I would personally like to welcome Michael Dobry to SCI-Arc, and that I hope that in the future years to come we can work productively. Also, I would like you to come to next week's lecture by Hani Rashid, who is a colleague of mine. He teaches at Columbia University. He will be giving the last lecture next Wednesday, so I hope all of you will show up for that lecture. And now, before I present to you tonight's speaker, allow me to briefly explain, or not to explain, but to introduce three thematic references from literature, and I use the word literature here, as a way to interweave and access into the rich domain of cyberspace. 1. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, he says that it was Homer and Hesiod who created for the Greeks their theogony, their gods, and the shape and form of their embodiment. Whereas in ancient India, a mythical story such as the Mahabharata was in one sense an epic version of hypertext, penned not by a single author, but by a multitude of unknown minstrels and authors over a period of many centuries. 2. Miguel Unamuno, the Spanish philosopher writer, once remarked that in reference to creating characters from inspired fiction, he says that Hamlet is more real than Shakespeare. Shakespeare died on a certain date, while Hamlet continued to transform the subsequent history of European thought. 3. In Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, Alice dreamed the existence of Red King, one of the characters in the novel, who in turn dreamed the existence of Alice. The dreams of their mutual existence form a kind of a closed loop in this case, and if one of them were to stop dreaming or wake up, both of them would disappear in the flesh, just like a flame. Needless to say, the potential richness of the emergent behavior of virtual reality and cyberspace in their interactive complexity in generating social constructions of reality in real time far exceeds anything that we can imagine beyond the dynamic synthesis of the references I just mentioned. And with this in mind, I would like to introduce to you tonight's speaker from the University of Texas, Austin, and who is one of the early proponents and advocate of cyberspace. He has already organized 2 conferences on cyberspace, And the third international conference on cyberspace will be held this coming May in Austin, Texas. He's also the author of 2 books, For an Architecture of Reality, and Deconstructing the Kimball. He has also written and edited the first cyberspace conference in a book form titled Cyberspace First Steps. Along with his teachings at the University of Texas, he's also the Chief Executive Officer of Mental Technologies Incorporated. He is no stranger to SCI-Arc since he has been here on a number of occasions for thesis reviews. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present Michael Benedikt.
Good evening, all. Hope you won't mind my sniffling and coughing every now and again. Has to do with the cold. See? It's a pleasure to be at SCI-Arc again, and thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Carl, for the introduction, and the committee for inviting me to be a part of your lecture series. I understood that this series was to be about science. But when I received the poster, I thought, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Certainly what I say tonight is as much philosophy as it is science, as much about ethics as it is about design, and as much about economics as it is about art. So now that I've mixed all those categories up, I will say this, that my talk is about the future, and I've called it New Spaces, New Depths. A few years ago, I wrote a small book, my first, which some of you may have read, called For an Architecture of Reality. It was a manifesto of sorts, arguing that buildings in our media-soaked age had a peculiar responsibility for maintaining our sense of what is real, for exemplifying what one might call the really real. I needed to say what it meant for buildings to have the quality of realness, and I identified 4 essential constituents: presence, significance, materiality, and emptiness. Today, I would add the quality of depth, making 5 in a way, but not really, since depth threads through and informs the other 4. Let me enlarge a little on the first 4. A building which aspires to have the quality of realness as paramount, I wrote, will have all of the 4 qualities I mentioned. First, an unapologetic presence. Sharp and clear, it would be assertive and a confident building. No matter how sensitive it was to its surroundings, it would not try to disappear, blend in, or joke itself away. A real building would not rely on conventional symbolism for its meaning, but have a living and equal significance to the people who designed it, built it, used it, and paid for it, by virtue of the process by which it was brought into existence. Truly real architecture would have, and even show off, its materiality. It would have definite and actual mass, tension, strength, temperature, tactility, no matter how lightweight it was. And finally, it would have emptiness. Emptiness, which is a sort of peculiar quality, after all this, of seeming both undesigned and artless, without an agenda, like a found object found to be useful or good, but intending to be neither. And this also with a measure of what you might call draw, or occupiability, which is what Kahn called silence. Now I find that I'm interested in another quality called depth. And perhaps this is just another attempt to put my finger on what the quality of realness really consists in, but this time with particular attention to the fact that the world is evolved, and us along with it, so that wherever we look and listen, we seem to be able to see and hear behind surfaces. We seem to be able to look into the past of everything not to see a movie history of it played out on some mental screen, but to see and understand somehow directly the layers of how it came to be built up like a geology. I should not say understand how it came to be perhaps, but rather more simply that we can relate to things and nature and animals and people because in some deep way our very consciousness already contains them in trace form. They resonate. When we experience a building that is deep, or hold an old and perfect artifact in our hands, or hear a song that is new and yet familiar, there are levels of our own mathematical reality, our own immensely long human history there that sing along in us. I really like this passage by the writer John Cheever, which I'd like to read to you. We drank in the garden. It was a spring day, one of those green gold Sundays that excite our incredulity. Everything was blooming, opening, burgeoning. There was more than one could see. Prismatic lights, prismatic smells, something that sets one's teeth on edge with pleasure. But it was the shadow that was most mysterious and exciting, the light one could not define. We sat under a big maple, its leaves not yet fully formed, but formed enough to hold the light. And it was astounding in its beauty, and seemed not like a single tree, but one of a million, a link in a long chain of leafy trees beginning in childhood. All of architecture, which we usually take to begin in earnest some 9,000 years ago, some 9,000 years before Christ actually, with the establishment of Jericho. All of this history represents no more than 1/500th of the time that we know man has been on the earth, and 1/1,000,000th of the time that mammals have been numerous. A time before which the essential elements of advantage accorded by shelter construction and site selection were already a part of all living and surviving. Temperature control, defensibility, proximity to food sources and fresh water, armor, view and privacy, identity, social activity support, and so on. And still, the sensibilities that give meaning to architecture are older. One cannot help but be awed at how much of what we take to be specifically modern in human feelings and problems emerge with general form intact from this unimaginably long history of perception, consciousness, hunger, mobility, sexuality, desire, and fear in the world. Paths of pursuit, places of surveillance, concavities of shelter, locations of food, traps, strongholds, graves. These, like drought and flood, are ecological givens common to all living terrestrial things. Given to and simultaneously are the significance of high places and low places, light places and dark places, near ones and distant ones, of inside and outside, cold and warm, soft and hard, easy to traverse, difficult to traverse, the fertile, the infertile, the fresh, the foul, of places bustling with others and places devoid of competition or company or one's own kind. The meanings of these places, far from culturally assigned or free for our invention, are givens for lions no less than for people, givens for all intents and purposes no less reliable than gravity itself. These are the factors that I see as the quality of depth in the world as such, in people and in buildings. When I teach a seminar on depth, and in a book I'm working on called The Architecture of Depth, I look at how depth expresses itself spatially in the directions of downness and innerness immersion. I look at how depth expresses itself in color. For example, asking questions such as, why do the petals and fruits and stained glass and wet things have a deeper color than anything you can paint? I talk about depth in terms of materiality. Again, something to do with the grain and consistency and the inner structure of objects. And I talk about depth as something about meaning, which is something about why certain places and things and events have the capacity to seduce us and then move us permanently. What I'd like to do now, however, is show you a round of slides. These slides are about the quality of realness and the quality of depth. I'm going to show you these slides in silence. I think that only in silence, in fact, can you appreciate them. I'll show them at about 20 to 30 seconds a pair, and it will take about 20 minutes to go through these slides. You might recognize some of these images, and after that I will pick up from there and talk to you about what I mean by the new spaces. Then show you another round of slides. This time there will be some commentary and explanation. So if we would, we'll just spend some time looking at the slides I've prepared for you. Someone turn off the lights in the upper studio room. you for, I didn't hear any snoring sounds. The title of my talk is New Spaces, New Depths. What you have seen has been old spaces and, in a way, old depths. To have a feel for the quality of realness and the associated property of depth has always been and will continue to be a goal for designers of the physical environment. But the world has changed, and it is changing before our very eyes. And we can neither close our eyes to it nor promote nostalgia and think our job is done. Advanced industrial societies, such as those of North America, Western Europe, and Japan, are rapidly evolving in their complexity. We are transcending concern with the material, with property, and even with labor, and we are becoming increasingly involved in the production and consumption of pure information. This information began largely having to do with the regulating and managing material production and labor, but it soon took on a life of its own, with the proliferation of meta levels of management and abstractions such as financial instruments, and indeed money itself, and with burgeoning consumer fashion, news, and entertainment cultures. In fact, today, we are ever more dependent on the channels of communication, ever more saturated by the media, ever more reliant on computers, and ever more divided culturally into the entertainers and the entertained, to the informationally adept and the unadept. The very circumstances of a free and meaningful human life are becoming kaleidoscopic, vertiginous. Under these conditions, the definition of reality itself is becoming uncertain. New forms of literacy and new forms of orientation are called for, as Marshall McLuhan foresaw in the 1960s. And between realness and depth, it is the dimension of depth, I believe, which can form the bridge between the real world and the virtual one that is taking place before our eyes. New spaces, virtual spaces, cyberspace. What is cyberspace? Beyond the worlds created by radio and film and television and books, by mathematics and mythology and science and art. For these are all worlds, you know, even though you cannot go into them, or should I say you cannot go to the bathroom in them, or feel the sun on your face. Beyond these, there are many piecing themselves together, rising like an Atlantis, and all these together form cyberspace. Let me describe to you what cyberspace is as though it were a fait accompli instead of one that is emerging. Cyberspace is the globally networked, computer-sustained, computer-accessed, computer-generated, multidimensional, artificial or virtual reality. In this world, onto which every computer screen is a window, objects seen and heard are neither physical nor necessarily representations of physical objects. They are rather, in form, in character, and in action, made up of pure data, of information. This information is derived in part from the operations of the natural physical world, but really is made of the immense traffic of information that constitutes human enterprise in science, art, business, and culture. Thus the dimensions, the axes, the coordinates of cyberspace are not constrained by the ones we're familiar with in the natural gravitational environment. Although the dimensions of cyberspace may mirror certain expectations we have of the real world, the object is optimal navigation and orientation in space, in information space. In cyberspace, information-intensive institutions and businesses such as banks, markets, and universities take on a form, an identity, and a working reality, quite literally an architecture that is counterpart and different to what we find in the everyday world. For example, no architect has ever designed a bank. Many architects say, I designed a bank. A bank, no architect has designed a bank. All an architect does is design the shell where people who do the banking can find each other. The bank itself is an organism of much, much greater complexity, and much more marvelous, in fact, than any building itself. So it is the ordinary physical reality of institutions such as banks, certain information businesses, are simply seen as surface phenomena, as husks, because their true energy, their true form, is contained in an architecture which is unseen, except in cyberspace. In cyberspace and in the world of the nets, in what Gibson calls the matrix, for those of you who read Gibson, egos and multiple egos, roles and functions have a new existence. Here, no individual is assessed only by virtue of his physical or her physical circumstances. New, liquid, and multiple associations between people become possible, motivated by economic and also non-economic factors. Virtual corporations, global games, everyday travel, new circles of scholarship, new realms for art. The world is changing, and architects must wake up to it and make our place in it. Cyberspace calls for an architecture which makes no claim to be real, but is nonetheless actual. This is an architecture that takes no space, but rather makes it in vast amounts. An architecture which we can be comfortably alone, and yet in the presence of millions. This architecture inhabits not the real world as we know it, but the landscape of unreality, that increasingly denser network of electronic communications, computation, and imagery that transforms our natural world. Cyberspace will have a geography and a physics and a natural character and a code of human law. This results from its consensuality. It will be bounded technically only by the limits of transmission and computing speed, and psychologically only by desire and the imagination within the constraints of consensuality. Its growth will proceed in principle indefinitely in accordance with each limit and the laws of economics. Cyberspace will require and in turn generate billions of dollars of economic activity, creating, amongst other things, the largest unreal estate market the world has ever known. In fact, the cultural and economic impact of cyberspace is going to be immeasurable. Now you may wonder, when is all this going to happen? The answer is, it is happening already, as you well know. Even if you take the most narrow view of cyberspace, that is, if we omit the unreal, consistent worlds already created by TV and the movies, if you take it only as that world created by network computers, then it is already immense, although not visible. As John Perry Barlow likes to say, cyberspace is where your money is right now. If you look at something called the Internet, it consists of 2,600 and 600 foreign complete networks of computers linked to each other worldwide. The traffic on this net is already staggering. Some 5 to 10 million people worldwide are personally connected through the Internet. They send email, messages, data, pictures, sound, and soon, God knows what, to each other. Traffic on the Internet alone is growing at the rate of 20% per month. Now, one of these nets, a fairly fast one, is called the NSF net, done by the National Science Foundation. This has now only recently been expanded to include commercial traffic. Another non-profit group called the Advanced Network was completing a network that will transfer data at 45 million bits per second, which is 30 times faster than NSFNet, which is 30 times faster than the Usenet or Internet you and I can now connect to. By 1994, this rate will be 622 million bits per second. And as most of you know, if Al Gore gets his way, we will have a billion-bit gigabit network by 1995. There's not a day that goes by, if you look at the newspaper, when some major telecommunications company, computer company, entertainment company, and software company are not forming some new kind of allegiance. What we are witnessing is not just the connecting of places with plumbing or wiring, but with annually doubling storage and processing capability, we are witnessing the creation of a new medium entirely. where real geographic place is irrelevant. More than just sensorially connecting distant real places, say with video or even 3D pictures and sound, and therefore bringing these places closer together, what we are witnessing will be the creation of a fictional, consistent, and wholly electrical third space. Places that exist nowhere and everywhere, whose light shines only in eyes and not on trees and streets. There may in fact be hundreds of cyberspaces someday connected to one another, owned and operated independently. Where do we come in? Cyberspaces, I believe, will require constant planning and control. The structures proliferating within them will require design, and the people who design these structures will be cyberspace architects. Schooled in computer science and in programming, in graphics and abstract design, schooled along with real space architects, cyberspace architects will design electronic edifices that are fully as complex and as marvelous and unique and beautiful as their physical counterparts, if not more so. Theirs will be the task of visualizing the intrinsically non-physical and giving inhabitable form to society's most intricate abstractions, processes, and organisms of evolution. In fact, I would say that from the viewpoint of architecture today, from architecture itself, cyberspace extends an inexorable process begun a long time ago, and which has gained new impetus earlier this century, namely the dematerialization of buildings. I could speak about this at length, but I think you understand me well. Indeed, architecture's most progressive practitioners and theorists of the day are already approaching the limit, the last steps of the conversion of architecture's constructional and material discourse into its purely intellectual, graphical, and logical content. It is with the development of virtual reality technology and of high-speed computing networks that these last steps of architecture, rather than regrettable, can be welcomed, not as the last steps at all, but as the first unwitting steps into a new, parallel, and alternative architecture, namely the architecture of cyberspace. Now I'm going to go on to some more slides. These will not be as beautiful as some of the ones you saw earlier, for the main reason that they have not had the benefit of 4 billion years of physical evolution, 2 billion years of biological evolution, 500,000 years of cultural evolution to produce their depth. They are the design work mostly of my students and colleagues, and they represent just the beginning of how we might imagine the possibilities of architecture in a wholly electronic realm. So I think I'll push on to the slides and talk about those. First set of slides. Want to take that light out? Okay, I'll go quite quickly through the first set here. For me, these two things are really about the nature of human communication and the way that space or spatial configuration supports that. Once one moves into an electronic realm, such as cyberspace, where we expect communication to carry on, there are many logical patterns which would want to be maintained. Next slide. The role of the physical, the idea of that manual work is also menial work, or that there's something here that needs to be transcended, continues, next slide, into the kinds of things we expect in the transmission of information about manual work. On the left we have a bunch of workers who, without plans, will finish that house without a second thought in terms of its engineering and design. On the right, in a strange way, our own hobbling of ourselves. What we see here is that nice old man in the white hair is telling the guy in the white coat everything he knows about fixing engines, so that this newbie can get all that information back out I wouldn't want him working on my car particularly. All right, next slide. On the left, a slide of what I believe is the very first Sony Walkman ad. And what I find very interesting is how well they understood exactly what it is that the Walkman does and what the Walkman is about, which is to replace the environment around you with a totally artificial sonic environment, with the technology of sensorial replacement. And from that point of view, you can see that VR is a natural extension of Walkman. What's interesting is that by this time next year, Sony will actually have a video Walkman for under $600. This will be 2 TV sets and a pair of sunglasses, which look like a pair of sunglasses, which will project a high-resolution steady image of a 36-inch TV screen 4 feet in front of your face, no matter where you're looking. So this is a consumer item that has been announced and will be here before, not this Christmas, but next Christmas. Next slide. The idea of sensory replacement, or the idea of it really started in the early 1960s. This is the work of Ivan Sutherland, the first head-mounted display, in fact, on the left. Next slide. One of the things to observe is really two radically different attitudes towards this sort of technology, which I take these two slides to be emblematic of. On the left, a dance with a robot arm, in which man somehow meets technology in some sort of graceful face-to-face way. On the right, an early picture of Jaron Lanier, whom I believe you had the pleasure of meeting earlier this semester. He is in this world that you see on the right, and I think he's probably lost if you've ever done this, you realize you can get to some extremely inelegant postures, because essentially your mind has gone, and your body is left to its own devices. Next slide. And some early material that most of you are probably familiar with now. Interestingly enough, these things are always collages. That is, one can never really show what it's like to be in a virtual world. And so the media are like flooded with pictures of people with sort of gigantic fish masks on their faces and these emblematic gloves. Next slide. But how different is this really? I waited amongst a bunch of nuns to get into St. Peter's, and in that little world created by their umbrellas and by their conversation, I saw something perhaps not too different from what you see on the right. Next slide. I'm sorry Wolf is not here this evening, but just to prove to you that Kolb Himmelblau was there first. This is Kolb Himmelblau in 1968. The walking bubble, and what is probably one of the most glorious renditions of VR that I've seen. Next slide, and of course, architects have long sort of... okay. Next slide, please. Architects have long sort of thought about the media environment as something portable, that is, as something that you carry with you. This is the Archigram's cushicle. Okay, next slide. And next slide. Now, within architecture itself, the idea of trying to sort of get beyond the walls, or to try to transform what architecture is about from the kind of immediacy or of perception, or from the pure phenomenology of form and material and emptiness and presence and all those good things. To have emphasized that the way I did is really to ignore another whole trend within architecture, which is the need to in some way transcend the given, either with this early Trompe or with the mathematization to the point where a building itself becomes less a building and it simply becomes an example, some sort of exemplar of mathematical prowess. Next slide, please. All man's constant need to get off the face of the earth, to reach higher. Why? Why do this if height was not about spirit, if it was not about, in fact, the release from earthliness and from gravity? Next slide, please. So what I'm trying to paint a picture of for you here is not so much notions of religion or religious architecture, which these are both examples of clearly, but rather the idea of this sense within architecture of transcendence, of trying to reach some other space, of trying to go beyond the wall and the surface. Next slide, please. Even in the machinery of theatre, what you see on the left is looking up at a proscenium of a 17th century theatre, where you can see the stage machinery on the left, the arch, proscenium, and the audience to the right. And notice the two completely different sort of machineries involved. It's almost like a mechanical interface between the left, which would be the inside of your computer, and the audience to the right. Next slide, please. By the time the Industrial Revolution comes out, the most amazing attack on the weight and materiality of architecture. First, the attempt to dissolve architecture into a sort of a gaseous, even if it's stone, maze. On the right, of course, the Crystal Palace, the first prefabricated, super lightweight piece of architecture. Again, trying in its own way to achieve infinities of direction, some kind of delirium about where to look and what surfaces are and what's real and what's not. Next slide, please. A familiar story, of course, to all of you, as Mies van der Rohe, early Mies van der Rohe, tries to take the dematerialization of architecture as absolutely far as he will go. He could go. Next slide, please. Perhaps the opposition posed here between two complete modes of architecture, for which, if I had a third slide, well, if you can imagine the slides you'll be seeing soon, cyberspace would simply have to be the next step of what you're seeing here. Next slides, please. Of course, once you divorce yourself from architecture's materiality, all kinds of abuses become possible. My favorite is this one on the right, all the design and flexibility of wood with the superiority of steel, but the forms of stone. So take your pick here. You can get it done. However, next slide, please. Lightness has produced some extraordinarily beautiful architecture too. Next slide, please. But never at the denial of materiality. I find that this publicity picture for Corb's Unité was absolutely remarkable in that, I think for me anyway, it really captures what Corb was trying to do on the roof of that building, and in fact on the roof of all of his buildings, which is a little like these pigeons here, to allow the top to fly. In other words, to allow, as in the symbol of the caduceus, to allow for the transcendence through the body, through the building, the body of the building, to something else. Next slide, please. A slide one person in this audience will recognize on the right because he took it, Andy Duncan, and the work of Stanley Seitovits in South Africa on the left. I take these to be excellent examples of architecture where materiality is the amount of material is taken to a minimum, but not materiality itself. However, when materiality itself is finally gone, next slide please, we'd arrive at a completely different kind of architecture. Here, a building is simply nothing more than a logical proposition. It has already, or a metaphysical tease, it has already now simply become an argument. Next slide, please. Some of the work of Diller and Scofidio I take in much the same way, as prefiguring a certain critique of architecture as losing its hold on logic. Next slide, please. On what's to be expected. And I also see in Diller and Scofidio's work, in fact, a rather prescient lament on the vanishing of a certain logic in architecture and its replacement with argument, pure positioning. Next slide, please. And of course, there is the electronification. Again, co-pinned on the left, something called the pulsating space frame. Archigram's Instant City. Next slide, please. On the left, a wonderful project again by Archigram called Log Plug, in which you go out into nature and find cable TV, hot and cold running water, beer, all hiding in these fake logs. And this nice project by Rem Koolhaas of some years back of the Barcelona Pavilion turned into a gymnasium, complete with sound system and what have you. Again, a cipher turned into a machine of experience with a nod, I suppose, towards the body. Next slide. These two now rather famous projects, I think, derive most of their logic from circuit boards, from the not the creation of places anymore, but the creation of sort of overlapping energies in which no one was able to specify what is actually supposed to happen here. And if you go to La Villette, you will see exactly how that works out. It's quite uncertain as to what's supposed to happen because it was designed without that sort of questioning. Next slide. And the next. Within art, on the left, this is The Large Glass by Marcel Duchamp. At one point he left that project alone, deliberately for a period of years to let it collect dust. So what you're seeing there is a photograph of dust on Marcel Duchamp's Large Glass, which he veneered in, which he shellacked into the thing. He was trying to open it to sort of accident. Duchamp, if you'd like to read sort of the Leonardo of the 21st century, if you'd like to read Leonardo's notebooks, you should read Duchamp's notebooks for the Large Glass. You'll see the whole Macintosh interface laid out there, and a lot else besides. On the right, of course, the Vietnam War Memorial, which comes as close, I think, as one could come to reducing architecture to its purely informational content. Next slide, please. I'll skip comments on these. Next slide. Now, within architecture itself, and this is some pages out of Bill Mitchell's so-called Logic of Architecture, we begin to see the computer attacking, if you will, the system by which architecture organizes itself. Which is to say, it begins to sort of open up the patterns. He chose, of course, Palladio, who's rather easy to do this with, but I take it as one more example of architecture itself as content, as phenomenological content, slowly being undermined. And yet, one can still see projects like this. Following. Next slide, please. This is a project called the Blue and Yellow Volume, Le Volume Bleu et Jaune, which is a study of a single room at the Villa de Medici in Rome, in which 4 French architects spent several years simply studying the relationship of view to light to sunshine in this room, created hundreds of drawings and models. Next slide, please. Looking for things like the movement of the sun, what they called corridors of transparency, extending geometries within it, and so on. Next slide. After all this study, all they did, next slide, was paint the room. And they painted it in two colors, blue and yellow, in such a way as to contain and retrace the information they found in there. Next slide, please. For me, this project, although it was in 1974, really marks a sort of a final move, if you will, from architecture as pure space, as pure light, as pure information, sort of inscribing itself into a realm that is quite beyond the physical here. Next slide. And exactly that same time, a Laurie Anderson video on the left, and a frame from an extremely seminal piece of video work by Ed Emshwiller called Sunstone. Next slide, please. And we begin to see now the ability to computer create spaces and places and effects that can leave the material, the act of painting and making, behind completely. Next slide. It's even possible, in fact easy and fun now, to take things like AutoCAD, a simple drafting program, and use it to deconstruct familiar buildings, to play with their geometries, to bring them in and out of alignment, to create, to make constructs which could not be built, which could never be built. Next slide. To make spaces which are made simply by taking buildings in, well, it would take a long story to tell you how these were done. But these are buildings which have been transformed from simple Platonic beginnings to their final result in a series of steps. Each step is then, Boolean subtraction is done from one step to the next until you are left with something which is nothing more than the traces of all the moves it took to get from the Palladian ideal to the actual building. Next slide. And it is also now possible to generate forms without any or very little intervention by yourself or by a designer at all. These compositions by Marcus Novak, my friend and colleague, as you'll see quite a lot of his work here, none of them have been designed by pencil, by sketch, or by intention. All of these forms, all of these places, all of these shapes, in fact, were made by transforms of things like music, of the spaces between letters and texts, of small algorithms that have been run chaotically until they arrive at these forms. Next slide. And then, of course, processed through things like Photoshop and so on. Now, one of the drawbacks. Well, I'll move on to something else. One of the things that's hardest to do on a computer, if you've tried to do this, is to convey or create on that screen a sense of immensity, a sense of spatial size. Next slide, please. This is back to David M., again in the middle 70s at JPL, where his ability to work with texture and with perspective, I thought, began to show how one could create spaces of great density and immensity. Next slides. Which begin to suggest what lies on the other side, so to speak, with cyberspace, what is possible. For example, look at the slide on the left. what we're seeing there is the approach towards an object. As we approach the object, it reveals more and more of itself, and we find that within it is yet another object, within it another, and so on and so forth. Now in the real world, as you know, if you walk up to something, you eventually will hit your nose. In cyberspace, it is quite possible to approach something infinitely and indefinitely, and for the thing to continue to reveal new information and new texture. Next slide. This is a pair of these works from an architectural point of view are slightly naive, but I still think they're immensely powerful. The one on the right particularly is called Trans-Jovian Pipeline. I'm sure William Gibson saw this at some point. But again, you have to understand that this is occurring on a screen no bigger than, your standard 19-inch screen. Okay, next slide. And the next. And the next. Trying to use data to invest and invent form. On the left is a simple transcription of the computer HAL on 2001 saying HAL. That is the actual sound print translated through Photoshop and some specially designed translators into a color map of frequency versus time. I'm not sure what the one on the right is at all, but we were experimenting again with trying to reach some sort of density. Next slide, please. Now, one more little trip into history before we go totally into cyberspace. One of the uses of cyberspace obviously is to contain ideas and to organize information. The ability to do this, or the desire to do this, next slide please, goes back some way. This is 1533, using buildings as memory aids. This is by the method of loci, and this is the work of Raymond Lull, and you'll see in a moment of Robert Flood. The idea being that the logic of architecture and the logic of buildings can be used to contain and to display and to organize much, much more information than can be done through text. Next slide, please. And that's really... Whoa. Okay. And this is the stepping off point which I'm going to use to move into cyberspace proper. Next slide, please. A very simple sketch exercise on the right, in which the problem was to create a 3D construct of something like the Random House Encyclopedia. We all know how books are organized. They're organized alphabetically, or by subject matter. Here is a 3D construct which tries to map the evolutionary diagram. What you'll see is time from the present on the left, going back by an exponential scale to the beginning of time at the back, at the top right. And you can see, in some sense, the whole story of evolution from mathematical through physical, through chemical, through biological, and so on, realities, up to art, religion, and so on, and the questions of experience. Again, a very, very early and very primitive attempt to do something, not too different from what you see on the left, which is Athanasis Kircher's attempt to map out the information as an index to the Kabbalah. Next slide, please. If you saw the book, you would have seen some of these illustrations. This is a rather half logical, half fanciful attempt to model slide library, in particular the architecture slide library, ours, in which the idea was that history in some sense repeats itself, which is to say architectural history goes through cycles of classicism, some form of decadence, such as Mannerism or the Baroque, some sort of return to the Romantic, to the primitive, and back to classicism. And if you could organize it this way, a construct of something like a slide library found in cyberspace might look something like this. Next slide, please. More interesting, however, was the idea that while you were there, logged in some way, either with helmets or simply looking at a screen, there would be other people, and those other people could be anywhere in the world. As long as they were logged into the slide library, that's where it would be. And of course, if you had any problems, there'd always be someone to help you. Next slide, please. Next slide. Finally, of course, one arrives in this case at the sort of information one's looking for. One of the problems in cyberspace, of course, in all virtual worlds, is how you represent other people. You could either put a photograph of yourself in there or a video of yourself in there. But the notion here is that one could find algorithmic constructs that reflected various aspects of your personality, various aspects of what you wanted other people to know about you in this rather fluid way. Next slide. Just something by Chumi that I thought was similar, but I think I'll pass over on this. Next slide. On the left, Chartres Cathedral, the stained glass of that. On the right, a project called Infinite Video, which perhaps is sort of a blockbusters of the future, in which essentially one enters this sort of rather infinitely long corridor. All around, every movie ever made is constantly playing. You drift down the center of this space, picking movies and scenes as one might flowers at a market, which then sort of drift down with you. It's sort of a completely different proposition about what it means to watch a movie. Next slide. A series here that I thought were rather interesting about the assumption for most of the time is that cyberspace is a sort of a big, empty, sort of electrical place or space, empty space. Here the idea that one could use multiple resolutions on a screen to allow information to sort of emerge, if you would, from the snow. Next slide. So that if you were at some kind of sales convention or at some sort of meeting, stuff would simply sort of emerge, if you will, from the background. Next slide. Which has certain technical advantages because, in fact, you can keep your computer power rather low if you can have a fluid control over the load on the machine itself. Next slide. It will be 4 slides on a project loosely inspired around the idea of a cyber cemetery. The idea, actually it'll come up in the next slide. The idea there, on the left, those little tiles are really other people, other users that are sort of left in cyberspace. The tracks and the trails are of their coming and going. On the left, some sort of institution. It might be the bank, it might be the cyber cemetery itself, although I believe that the cyber cemetery is this construct you see on the bottom left of the right slide. Next slide. Again, in all these cases, what we're trying to do with the computer is a number of things all at once. First, make some quasi-rational supposition about what sorts of worlds can be made on the other side of the computer. The other, of course, is to force a tremendous density of information as far as possible into it. The idea, the scenario behind this is in fact that when you die, you leave a record of yourself in the cyber cemetery. People then visit the cemetery, they double click on your tombstone, and you emerge to entertain and instruct. Scenes from your life are readily available, etc., as are memorabilia. It's a little like a sort of Italian cemetery, except completely electronic. The idea would be also that every year your data files would be compressed. Every year, that is, that you're not visited by someone. So that if your grave is neglected, your tombstone's neglected, eventually sort of jerky, blurry patterns will come out of it. This is an incentive to keep your relatives visiting, to keep your files fresh. Next slide, please. Some attempts here to get just a little more scientific about it, which is to begin to use the 3 dimensions of space itself to represent some rather hard data. What we might look on the right, we're seeing the use of a submarine navigation metaphor, but it's really financial data you're looking at. On the left, turbine blade velocity, actually from an engineering journal, in which I was completely struck by the embedding of data in the 3-dimensional space without actually saying what that data is yet. Next slide. So on the left, you'll see a similar sort of idea used, whereby we're looking at an acoustic analysis of an auditorium, as a matter of fact, and what you see floating around in there are things called data jacks. Those data jacks represent volume and reverberation characteristics of sound at every point in that auditorium, at least the points you see. Now on the right, taking that idea a little further, is another attempt to do that slide library. Here we're in a space in which the first 3 dimensions of the data are put up on the wall, and you see in the veggies, if you will, and the blocks, how much is available at that particular intersection point of the X, Y, and Z axis. Next slide. If you were to click when the crosshairs, the large crosshairs are where they are, a smaller space bursts open, which you see on the right. Now what's interesting about this, and this contains the information you're looking for, you've been searching by architect, by date, by whatever criteria you want. What's interesting is that if you were to move the crosshairs on the left just a little bit, the entire contents of that box would change. But on the other hand, you could move the inner space or the inner box to any position you liked and it would not change. Next slide, please. Someone else took this and tried to see what would happen if we multiplied it out. Next slide. So that, next slide, please. So that in fact, one would have a multiple number of these cells, each with data inscribed on their walls. Next slide, please. Until one actually developed it into a geography or an urban landscape where one would float or move over, as it were, a honeycomb of these inverted cells whose ownership was described by these beams of light, if you will, that collect and name the various databases that were collected there. A clock orientation system, so that a little like the world that Pac-Man lives in. If you travel towards 2 o'clock for long enough, you would come up at 8 o'clock, or 12 to 6 and so on. And the idea here of ascending through velocity zones, so that the higher you went, the faster you could travel, the fewer were the landmarks, a little like office buildings, as a matter of fact. And the similarity of this particular landscape, sort of a picture of the Matrix, if you will, to Los Angeles at night, I thought was rather interesting. Next slide, please. And although I don't really have the time here to go into it, I think it's really not a coincidence of the forms that a city takes when it is based on information. Next slide, please. Finally, I'll show you some slides here of another whole series of experiments on using the computer to compose architectures which could have no correlate at all in physical space. All of them are made by using algorithmic processes rather than hand design. They're used using montages and creating sort of effects of both data containment and transmission into new spaces, which no building could possibly get to. Next slide, please. Okay. Next slide. Now, right now it takes up to 48 hours to render one of these images. You have to imagine a time when computers would be able to do this 60 times per second, because that's what it'll take to move into worlds like this. Next slide. Okay. Let me wind up here. Cyberspace cannot and will not replace reality. It is merely a new medium for the proliferation and the complexification of consciousness, of life on Earth as such. Consider this. Just as printing did not replace but displaced writing, just as writing did not replace but displace storytelling, just as movies did not replace theater or dreaming or thinking in their historical modes, cyberspace will not replace art museums, concerts, parks, sidewalk jugglers. It will not replace sex, books, buildings, or radio. The fact is that each of these media and architecture as it is will have to move over a little and to concentrate on what it is that it is good at. It is, if only to resist the Disneyfication of all buildings that I see today, that cyberspace is needed. Cyberspace transcends mere simulation and entertainment to create a fluid world that has no claim to reality at all and that has no harm to the environment. The dream of the transcendence of the body and earth through the magic of place and light lies deep within the tradition of architecture. Cyberspace in this sense may be a new medium, a new venue for this pursuit, but it is not a new thought or a new desire. And it is from within the same noble tradition of architecture that the other pole is drawn to. The love of the real, the solid, the stable, the timeful, the love of place and person, the fragrance of wood and coffee, of stone and water and light and heat, and all the myriad inflections and reflections that only real buildings can provide. The blossoming of a delirious parallel electric world in cyberspace should not give us pause. Depth is everywhere to be explored. And I'd like to show you three or four more slides and say thank you. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. We really should not have to choose between these worlds. I think we can have them both. Thank you so much. Please feel free to take off and feel free to ask questions too.